for you joining us. Welcome, colleagues. A huge appreciation from the WBS, the WITS Business School team, for joining us on this very important webinar today. We have international guest speakers, and of course, we've got you as well, that we are looking forward to engaging on this topic. Today's discussion of the webinar will be focusing on employer ownership, and we have titled it as Time for Real Socio-Economic Dialogue. This webinar was positioned in the wake of Workers' Day, and in light of the very critical discussion around employee ownership and the place that it holds in the work context is pivotal to each one of us. And today we are going to be talking about this in much detail. WBS is always proud to launch and to host such events, especially on topics that cut across the workplace and economic concerns. Today we are joined with our international speakers. I will start by introducing Prof. Paul and Prof. Paul and Mr. Rhodri Packman, who are both from CWMPAS, the main corporate development agency in Wales, in the United Kingdom. Both have played key roles in advising and helping UK companies in improving employee engagement and achieve sustainable growth. Also on the panel is Mr. Mbatha, who may be joining us, but Mr. Mbatha is currently in KZN, and he is attending to some of the crisis relief that is currently happening. So if Mr. Mbatha is available, we might be joined by him, but we are pleased to have Prof. Paul and Mr. Rhodri, who are going to share their insights on this very relevant topic. So I'm looking forward to this as much as you are, I'm sure. I would also like to hand you over to my colleague and co-speaker, Mr. Thandani. And maybe, Thandani, please, if you could give us your insights on the topic, and then, of course, we will then move on to our guest speakers. Thank you so much. Thandani, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Janika. And thank you, the panelists, and welcome the delegates. As indicated, I'm going to present about the role and plans of Southern Africa Employee Ownership Association on how to increase the uptake of employee ownership in South Africa. Then I will share the screen. I think I will need to be assisted by Jayton here on sharing the screen.
Okay, no problem.
Is it visible?
Yes, it is, sir. You just go into presentation mode, please.
Thank you, Jayton. Is it on presentation mode? Yeah.
Yes, it is, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as I indicated, I'm going to just present a few slides around employee ownership. I think mine is just an introduction in a way, and even share a little bit of experience. I think Dr. Gobind has already indicated to say this webinar has been convened on the basis that May is regarded as a workers' month. As we know that the 1st of May every year, we celebrate, it's a workers' day. Then that's why we indicated somewhere there to say celebrating workers' month, having an in-depth thinking of employees' economic rights. That's what I will be focusing on a little bit when I'm emphasizing on the point of uptake of employee ownership in South Africa. As indicated, I'm Thandani Ramondo, one of the founding directors of Southern Africa Employee Ownership Association. Then my presentation is going to touch on the following areas. Then we'll indicate who is the association, what is employee ownership, why employee ownerships, type of employee ownership, uptake of employee ownership in South Africa, opportunities to increase the uptake of employee ownership in South Africa, sector, value chain, and state-owned enterprise restructuring driven by employee ownership strategy, and then South Africa employee ownership policy proposal and conclusion. Then who are we as Southern Africa Employee Ownership? Southern Africa Employee Ownership Association is a legally established and registered not-for-profit company. It is registered in terms of Companies Act of 2008 as amended. The association was founded by 3 initial directors having diverse qualification, skills, expertise, and experience in the following areas: broad-based Black economic empowerment, economics, employee ownership. For more information about board of directors or the teams for the association or directors and advisory council members, please visit our website, which is www.saeoa.org. The main objective to establish the association is to facilitate smooth and proper implementation of employee ownership awareness and advocacy, advocating for the right employee ownership policy that shall yield real tangible economic benefits for broad-based employees. What is employee ownership? According to the definition by National Center for Employee Ownership based in the United States of America, defines employee ownership as follows. Employee ownership is a term for any arrangement in which a company's employees own shares in the company stock. In simple definition or terms, is that employees are allowed to acquire equity shares in the companies where they work and then hold shares through a legal entity in the form of trust or cooperatives for the benefit of all qualifying employees, guided by the legal entity rules, which means if it's the trust, it will be guided by the trust deed of that entity, or if it's a cooperative or worker cooperative, it will be guided by the Cooperative Act and the constitution of that specific cooperative. If employee ownership is implemented correctly or right, employee ownership can transform a company, improve performance, and accelerate growth. It can create a sustained competitive advantage, driving business success that builds wealth for founders or shareholders or investors and employees as shareholders, as well as funders or financiers may see their return quicker, because most of the time the shares will be funded through the loans and the funders will expect the loans to be paid back to them. Why employee ownership? Employee ownership is a vehicle or an economic strategy or policy that has potential to contribute or eliminate the following for employees. Facilitate in terms of saving jobs, facilitate creation of jobs, address ownership with regard to success for old age owners or baby boomers, as they are called in other countries. Facilitate easy distribution of wealth to majority broad-based employees, reduce income inequality gap, which I think in South Africa we know that the income inequality gap is very huge. Then we really believe that employee ownership can be a catalyst in reducing income inequality gap. And it may also assist a lot in alleviation of poverty, because now the workers won't be regarded just as workers. They will also contribute, they will also earn additional income with regard to maybe dividends that will be declared by the company. What will employees get from participating in employee ownership program? Most of the time, employees will get financial payoff or additional income in the form of dividends. Then most of the time, based on the research done in other countries, you'll find that there will be fair treatment because now they will be regarded as co-owners of the company. It builds sense of ownership because if now they are properly educated, now they will now believe that they form part and parcel of the company. Employee influence on management and other stakeholders of the company. Then individual influence on decision affecting day-to-day work in the company. Types of employee ownership. Employee ownership can either be direct or indirect. Then direct employee ownership. Under an employee ownership plan, employees hold shares or have the option to purchase shares in their company at discounted or tax-efficient rates. Then indirect employee ownership, a company is owned in full or part by trust on behalf of its employees. But when you look at the direct and indirect, in South African perspective, you find that South Africa implement more of indirect employee ownership than the direct employee ownership. The shares are either held by the trust or cooperative. SA or South Africa will either use Trust Property Control Act or Cooperative Act to register the legal entities that will hold shares on behalf of the employees. Other countries like United Kingdom implement a lot of hybrid model, where simultaneously you will find that in one company you will have individual workers or employees owning shares directly in the company, as well as sometimes you get a lot of employees owning shares through the indirect employee ownership using employee ownership trust, which I think our guest speakers will share more on the experience of United Kingdom. Direct employees either compromise either their wages or bonus to acquire equity stake in the company. The shares acquired shall be transferred to a natural persona instead of juristic persona in this instance. The juristic persona will only be applicable on indirect employee ownership. Uptake of employee ownership. The appetite of employee ownership is steadily increasing in the country. However, it is mostly influenced by pressure exerted by broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act, as it is linked to BE scorecard. Some companies are doing or implementing employee ownership for compliance purposes with less or zero economic benefit, or benefits take too long to be realized by the target employees. And why sometimes it's like that? It's the model that we normally utilize to finance employee ownership. Sometimes you find that the whole shares that are given or sold to the workers or employees are loan funded, and then the employees trust will take long to repay back the loan, because most of the time the loan will be repaid back through the dividends that is accrued, and the financier will most of the time will ship 100% of the dividends declared at that time to service the loan. However, there are companies now implementing employee ownership schemes in South Africa. Recently, I think last week or 2 weeks back, Shoprite launched and announced their employee share ownership scheme of approximately 8.9 billion to benefit approximately 126,000 employees. Then I think there was a full article which we also shared through LinkedIn, whereby it was giving some description of the Shoprite employee ownership scheme. Some companies who have implemented employee ownership, just recently, we know Capitec launched it, I think 2 months back or 3 months back. We had PepsiCo, AB InBev, Barloworld, Woolworth, more also in the mining houses like your Exaros of this world, Anglo-American. Then we know that some of them, they've implemented employee ownership, share ownership schemes. There are small equity shares owned by employees in various companies, but the schemes are unannounced in media. data is not recorded anywhere or is not also in public domain, as there is no institution recording such data in the country, then we know that sometimes, yes, you can approach the BE Commission in South Africa. Maybe they might share some of the data, but I don't think the data that they will have, it will be updated to date. The shares will range from 5% to 26%. That's what you normally see in the market in South Africa with regard to employee ownership. Opportunities or stimulants to increase the uptake of employee ownership in South Africa. Increase appetite by public and private sector, unions, researchers, academics, banks and investors and funders. There is huge appetite whereby if I think we start engaging more, I think we can see the uptake of employee ownership increasing significantly in the country. Existence of benchmark best practices, lessons learned, research papers on employee ownership globally, spanning over 41 to 42 years, which I think those are some of the things that I read. I think if you check the National Center for Employee Ownership Association has just celebrated 41 years in existence, and they have a lot of data that they've captured. Employee Ownership Association based in UK, they just celebrated 42 or if not 43 years in existence, and they always publicize a lot of data around employee ownership, but specifically focusing on in UK for UK. But most of the information is mostly replicable in South Africa or any other country in the continent of Africa. Employee Ownership Association of Australia. You also have International Association for Financial Participation, which looks more on employee ownership in the European side. Increased and existence of well-documented success stories on employee ownership, both locally and internationally. As I said, internationally, you will find that it's more research papers, but whereas in the South African perspective, you'll get more of media or articles, newspaper articles that have been released when the companies are launching maybe their schemes. But we don't have really well-researched information or data that one can say there is a document that one can rely on. Existence of tested policies and models on employee ownership trust. This is a tax-driven model. I think this model is implemented or founded more in United Kingdom. And one of the person who contributed in crafting the employee ownership trust is Graham Nuttall. And as the association, we have very good relationship with Graham Nuttall. He's trying to help us on how we can also try to implement similar type of a model in South Africa. There is availability of potential funding using either impact investment or environment, social and governance, or equity equivalent in South African side when we look on the BBE perspective. Government incentives use either certain percentage of enterprise development and socio-economic development, which are also linked to BEE. Then I think it's just a matter of saying, how do we engage with government around this issue and maybe structure some certain percentage of EED or ESED, as well as equity equivalent, to say how best can it be utilized to finance or set up a fund that can finance employee ownership. Or with regard to impact investment and ESG, we know that a lot of companies now, they have programs around programs that are supported with funding on impact investment and ESG. We really believe that maybe if we engage robustly, then we might be able to find a way of saying how best can we use impact investment or ESG to facilitate funding for employee ownership. And then again, there is a very good research that was done by 50 by 50, or supported by Besta Foundation, whereby they came up with a model on how we can utilize impact investment to finance employee ownership. There is willingness and appetite by the banks starting to explore better ways to finance employee ownership. Maybe we need to engage more banks, maybe to craft a specific funding that can be utilized to finance employee ownership. Government passing policies and setting budget aside, setting funding schemes dedicated to finance employee ownership. This one is not really happening in South Africa, but I think as South Africans, we can engage on this and say, how best can we do that? And maybe come up with policies and maybe set up budget. I've seen in America, the trend that is developing in America now, then you find that a province or a state, they come up with their own plan and their own policies on how to drive employee ownership in that specific city or in that specific province. Increased awareness and advocacy and engagement with all relevant key stakeholders in the country. Then uptake strategies with regard to sector-based one. I think on this one, I categorize it in 3 ways to say, if we want to increase uptake of employee ownership, maybe we can go sector-driven strategy. Then we are saying possible or potential way to speedily increase the uptake of employee ownership in South Africa. It can be easily be propelled by 3 key strategies. However, these proposed strategies will require full buy-in of the following key stakeholders. It will be government from the policy perspective as policymakers, companies in relation to private sector, unions, funders, and then we can bring other key role players there. And then with regard to EOE sector-driven strategy, in South Africa, with regard to BBBE, we have what we call sector charter. And the sector charter, these are the same as transformation charters and are developed by major stakeholders in the relevant industries. They are referred to as sector charters for as long as they are gazetted under Section 12 of the BBBE Act. Sector charters must include in their gazetted strategy, encourage companies in that specific sector, prioritize the use of employee ownership as a key to speed up transformation. Companies driving transformation through employee ownership must obtain higher rewards or BE scores in terms of the BBBE scorecard. Mobilize resources, including funding to provide either cheaper funding or incentives where necessary. Transformation sector must take a lead in advocating for employee ownership, e.g., the association is looking forward to advocate for employee ownership sector. Then the association has already developed the model called franchising through employee ownership, energy generation through employee ownership, mining through employee ownership, agriculture through employee ownership. If you check most of these sectors like franchising, as well as energy and mining, you'll find that they are not well transformed. Then we really believe that maybe if we can bring employee ownership, then it might speed up transformation in those sectors because they will be able to deal with the element of ownership using employee ownership as a better vehicle. Then the sector-based driven model can be very empowering and speed up real transformation across all economic sectors. Educate sector members about the pros and cons on employee ownership. Then the second point, we know that our state-owned entities are facing a lot of problems. And you can start to see slowly that that government is trying to either, even though they are denying in one way or the other, they are trying to restructure them through privatization. And as the association was saying, most state-owned entities have a lot of economic opportunity to drive transformation, save jobs, create jobs, and distribute wealth to broad-based employees. E.g., Eskom, as SAA, South African Airways, DNL, SABC, Post Office, they have those opportunities that I can go today and show you to say, if we use employee ownership, we can unlock one or two opportunities to drive transformation, or maybe plug in employee ownership in those entities. It will be significant to allow employees working in SOEs to acquire equity stake in these entities as part of broad-based privatization through employee ownership. This approach will be better. It will be better than widely criticized. No, it will be better than privatizing SOEs through individuals, individual BE. E.g., we know that now we have a contestation around SAA versus Takatso Consortium, transaction widely criticized by various key players, including Treasury or Department of Finance. We know that even opposition parties, political parties, are totally against this transaction in one way or the other. But we are saying, as the association, maybe there might be other better way to privatize state-owned entities. Thereafter, government may finance part of employee acquisition as a strategy to speed up transformation, instead of always bailing out the state-owned entities with no success stories on the bailout or post-bailout. Furthermore, government may explore other formalized ways to finance employees' equity and unlock economic benefit for employees. Government, board of directors, and management should start exploring the right policy choice by implementing the employee ownership model before these entities totally collapse. Employee ownership may be better suited to be implemented in the following SOEs: SABC, South African Post Office, DNL, etc. Then the third leg of opportunity, we say value chain strategy. Encourage companies to provide meaningful procurement opportunities to employee ownership trust through in the value chain. Companies providing procurement opportunity to employees must be rewarded with certain percentage under the ownership element measurement, BE scorecard. We know that the measurement is about 25%. Then maybe if a company provide that type of opportunities to employees, maybe DTI should start to say that type of a company should earn maybe 10% out of the 25 or 15% out of the 25. We know that this one will be like a policy change to DTI, which is open to engagement and thorough discussion. The procurement opportunity provided to employees need to be funded by either enterprise development or equity equivalent or government incentives. Alternatively, set up a fund dedicated to finance employee ownership transition. In South Africa, state-owned entities like Eskom, DNL, etc., have huge value chain opportunities that can speed up the uptake of employee ownership. Eskom is sitting with a time-ticking bomb of energy deficit. Maybe it might be prudent for Eskom to give power purchase agreement to an employee trust. Employee trust will raise funding to build either solar or wind farms to generate energy and sell back to the energy, sell back the energy to Eskom to mitigate total energy blackout. And B, this initiative will transfer real economic value or rights to employees. South African, as the association, we will want to propose policy proposal. SA needs its own well-defined employee ownership as an economic policy not embedded or linked to broad-based Black economic empowerment. Employee ownership must take into consideration transfer of economic rights to broad-based employees. Employee ownership policy must be backed up by employee ownership fund, which is blended by the incentives. All of the above may be achieved through robust policy engagement with all relevant stakeholders, government, companies, unions, policy practitioners, researchers, academics, universities, employee ownership practitioners, experts. The outcome of the robust engagement may lead to proper policy that is beneficial to all participants and contribute to real economic growth. Then in conclusion, South Africa Employee Ownership Program has potential to yield the following: EO policy formulation, funding incentives, EO fund, tax efficient model, coordinate guide on the development of implementation plan, coordinate EO database, EO monitoring and evaluation, EO research, lesson learned, best practices and benchmarks. That will be more South African based information. The only thing required in South Africa is to properly engage deeply, to define clear employee ownership policy framework, advocacy, awareness, training, education, to change people's mindset and culture. For the company to implement employee ownership effectively and successfully, you need to have sober mind is the medicine to implement EO. EO must be implemented so to facilitate and increase the economic rights and participation of the employees. Employee ownership must contribute to growing economy, create decent employment opportunities, eradicate poverty, contribute to reducing income inequalities, and improve the socio-economic livelihood of the target beneficiaries. In that short, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the South African Employee Ownership Association perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Tendani. I think that was quite a comprehensive explanation on the South African landscape. And that sets us quite nicely, I think, for our next speaker, which of course, Tendani, you will be introducing. And that is Mr. Rhodri Packman, who is all the way from the UK and is indulging us today with his time. And thank you so much for that. And Tendani, back to you for the introductions of our speakers. And thank you once again, Mr. Packman, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gobit. I will take the opportunity to introduce our guest speakers. Then I will introduce both of them. We have Professor Paul Cantrill, and then he's a specialist advisor on employee ownership for CWMPAS, formerly the Wales Cooperative Centre, the main cooperative development agency in Wales and unique in the UK. He has advised many companies in becoming employee-owned, and through his work at CWMPAS, has advised Wales government. He acted as Welsh advisor to the UK government inquiry into employee ownership. He has supported the UK Employee Ownership Association and contributed to the work supporting the Graham Nuttall's 2014 report, which has been pivotal in the increase in employee ownership. He has past career involved in the private sector at a director level and 10 years with Birmingham Council, Europe's largest unitary local authority, including Assistant Director for Enterprise and Head of Creative Development. He has awarded an honorary professorship by Birmingham City University for his work with small business in the city. Professor Cantrill will be our guest speaker. He's accompanied by Rhodri Packman as a co-guest speaker. Rhodri is a market development advisor on employee ownership from CWMPAS, for the Wales Cooperative Centre. Rhodri has had over 20 years experience working with small businesses in the UK. He has background in marketing, HR, and management, is especially more relevant than ever in promoting employee ownership as a model in the Welsh Welsh business looking to improve employee engagement, growth, and their business, and ensure long-term sustainability. Welcome, Prof. Cantrill, as well as Rhodri Packman. But Rhodri will be the first one to present to us, and thereafter he will hand over to Paul. Thank you. You are welcome. You can bless us with our all employee ownership information in UK. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Let me try sharing my screen so you can get up my presentation. How's that looking? Is that okay?
Yes, that's looking great.
Fantastic. So, as I said, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Let me just tell you a bit about who I am. I'm kind of the warm-up act for Paul, so he's our expert. So Professor Paul is the expert. I'm just going to give you an overview of who we are as an organisation, and a little bit of the Welsh context, really, so you can understand kind of where we are. So I'm Rhodri. I work within the employee ownership team at an organisation called CWMPAS. And as we've mentioned, I kind of look after the marketing and promotion of our services, but also part of my role is to try and educate businesses and the business owners about employee ownership. And we've got a big job on with that, really, because it's still not a very well-known business model. So part of my job is to try and educate the business community about what employee ownership is. So who are we as an organisation? Well, we're a cooperative and we are a development agency trying to work for positive change within Wales. Our focus is really on building a fairer and a greener economy. And I think really importantly, what we're trying to do as an organisation is develop a more equal society where people and the planet come first. And personally, I think it's really important to believe in something and to work for an organisation with a vision. And I think it's important for us as an organisation, because that feel that we have for making positive changes, that really affects the way that we work with businesses in terms of employee ownership, and it shapes the kind of support that we offer. Now, I don't want to get too political about things, but the current economic system in the UK and in Wales is failing. It's failing to tackle the key challenges that we face, whether that's climate change, whether that's economic hardship. And we kind of believe that it doesn't have to be that way. The UK economy, the Welsh economy could and should, more crucially, work in the interests of everybody. And it's our mission as an organisation to help change that, to help shape this, and to help make things work better for everyone. Are the slides moving?
No, they're not.
Okay. There we go. Small technical error. So a little bit of background about who we are. So we started our journey as an organisation back in 1982 as the Wales Cooperative Centre. Traditionally, we were supporting the growing development of cooperatives in Wales. From here, we've grown and developed and offer now support to a wide range of social businesses. With regard to employee ownership, we started with Tower Colliery back in 1995, and I believe Paul will be telling you a lot more about that later on, so I'm not going to say any more. And more recently, we've rebranded as CWMPAS, which gives us a new image, a new perspective, and trying to move forward with some of the work that we do. We currently employ over 100 people across many different projects across the whole of Wales. And that kind of takes us to where we are today. And we're delivering support to social businesses And certainly as a team of employee ownership specialists, we're looking to work with private businesses. And I think importantly, because of our background as a cooperative centre, because of the values and the ethos that we hold dear, we're looking to work with those businesses that have a real social and democratic conscience. So those businesses that really want to invest in Wales, in their community, in their businesses, to make it better for everyone. And we're very fortunate that the businesses and the business owners that we support can access our high quality advice and hand-holding in a way that absolutely costs them nothing. We're fortunate to have been funded from European funds, to be supported by the Welsh government. So we can really dedicate time and effort to supporting those businesses as they look to move through their employee ownership journey. And we firmly believe that employee ownership is particularly relevant to us here in Wales. And I will talk about succession planning and the issues that we face as a country with that in a moment. But we are generally, as a country, quite rural, and very much our communities are based on that community spirit. We've got a few urban cities thrown in. I think the whole population of Wales is 3 million, which probably sounds tiny to you. And I think our capital city, Cardiff, has approximately 480,000 people. So we're very much a nation of small communities. And it may be an oversimplification to say it and describe it in this way, but it feels like as citizens, as people of Wales, that we share something. It feels like when I step out of the door that everybody knows everybody else, or at least, you know, my auntie seems to know everybody or knows everybody or has a story to tell about everybody. We're kind of interconnected in that way. And no matter where I am in Wales, I can usually bump into somebody that knows somebody else, or an ex-colleague, or an organization that I've worked with, or somebody that knows someone else. And it feels like we almost rely on each other. And I can't quite describe what that is, but it feels like we're connected in this way. You know, and we have, our communities are based around clubs and associations, whether that's social clubs or political clubs, or even, dare say it, rugby clubs, which I know we need to improve on our rugby, but we're very close knit. And businesses and the business owners that we work with and the employees, we're not just invisible faces. Those businesses have a unique part in the community. And I think it's important to recognize that and recognize the role that employee ownership can have in that. And I guess that's why we really support employee ownership in Wales. It matters. It makes it different. It makes it different to support those businesses. It makes it different to support those business owners looking to perhaps sell their businesses. And as we've heard, that employee ownership does make a difference to the economy. It can make it better for everybody, and we can make it work for those businesses in Wales. This is us as a team. We don't need to go through that, but we're a small team of six of us working with businesses across Wales. I think this may be of more interest. I mentioned succession planning earlier, and a few years ago we conducted research, which we've now titled The Succession Time Bomb in Wales. And from reading the stats on the screen there, you can probably see why we've got this looming problem. We've got older employees, we've got older owners, we've got many businesses without plans in place. We've got businesses who are facing closure. So what are we going to do? How are we going to sell these businesses? Who's going to buy them? Are we going to sell to competitors? Are family members going to pick up ownership of some of these businesses? Is it going to be left to serial entrepreneurs, competitors? What's the future for some of these businesses that are rooted in our communities? Well, why not the employees? Why not look to employee ownership? And again, not just because it helps retain those jobs, not just because it's good for our communities, but as we've already heard from the South African examples, it can be really good for the economy. It can be really good for those businesses. And because in the UK, we've seen that it is proven to be a really strong and successful business model. It's highly progressive. It's a highly progressive model of ownership. So it's really good for future growth. But it's also really good for those businesses that are not just looking to sell and using employees as a way of buying the business, because that could be the only option. Employee ownership in the UK, and we've seen it in Wales, and Paul will touch on this in a little bit more time, but it's a great way of boosting employee ownership. It's a great way of rewarding those employees and kind of taking it to the next level. And that's why we're really passionate about employee ownership in Wales. We feel it kind of fits who we are as a country, who we are as a people, and backed up with the information in the Nuttall report and the information that we've already heard about, it can make a real difference to the businesses, to the employees, to the communities, and to the economy as a whole. If you want to know more information about the support that we offer, the businesses that we work with, you can see the link to our website there. Go to employeeownershipwales.co.uk, and you can find out a lot more about who we are and what we do. Okay, that's probably enough from me. I'm going to hand you over to Professor Paul Cantrill, who will tell you a lot more in detail about the work that he's doing with businesses in Wales, and the kind of employee ownership solutions he is working on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rhodri. Now I want to upload my presentation. Jayton, can you help me on that?
Hi there, sir. Are you able to see the share screen button?
Yep.
Wonderful. You are sharing currently?
Sharing.
You're just going to presentation mode, please.
Okay.
Wonderful. All good. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, good afternoon to you all, and I want to say thank you very much to everyone who's been involved in this event and for inviting us to share some thoughts with you today about the work we're doing on employee ownership. In particular to Tendani, who I feel I know as a friend now, having communicated for some time, very pleasantly, I might add. And it's really nice, Tendai, to meet you, and thank you very much for your support. And also for delivering a very interesting talk about South African employee ownership, which, as I admitted to you early on, I'm not an expert on, but I feel a little bit better informed now as a result of all of that. And clearly there are many exciting possibilities ahead of you, and anything we can do to support you in that, and reciprocally anything you can do to help support us will be very welcome. Moving on to some detail now. Rhodri's explained that we have a scheme for supporting employee ownership and have done now for a few years. And you might ask yourself, what do we actually do? Well, these are some of the sort of things that we do for companies. Obviously, we advise them on employee ownership, goes without saying. But what we're trying to do really is to demonstrate to them that it will work. Because lots of people seem to think in the private sector that employee ownership is some kind of not really proper business, really. Why would you want to sell to your employees? So we have to spend a lot of time trying to explain, well, it does work. And in order to do that, we need certain tools to help us. So these are some of the tools that we use to help encourage owners and employees to think about employee ownership. So we obviously do business evaluations. The valuation of companies is quite important in the work that we do, because ultimately we have to raise money to help establish the transition to employee ownership. And in order to do that, we need to know what the valuation is. We need to ensure that when owners leave, there is good leadership in place. And if they don't leave, the leadership that's there at the moment is protected. So leadership development is quite important. Financial advice, showing them that if they go down a particular route, that the finances will work. And tax advice. Tax advice, as I'll tell you a little bit more in a bit more detail in a moment, is quite important to the work that we do. And obviously ongoing advice. So our work doesn't end when a business is sold to its employees. In some ways, it begins there, because what we've then got to do is to try and help the new employees, the employees, or the new owners rather, we've got to help them establish and build the business that they've inherited. Let's talk about a little bit about why are we doing all of this? Well, there are shared economic challenges, I think, for most of the developed world. And EO can make a contribution to those. So if we take, for example, inequality, in many of the so-called developed countries of the world, and the UK is one of those, if you look at the top 10% and their national income, it's a very high percentage of the national income accrues to that 10%. So income is not universally distributed, is it? I'm sure you're all aware of that. So what we need to do really is to find ways in which we can get a better balance. And Piketty, a chap called Piketty, who's a French academic, who's the world expert on inequality, and I urge you to look him up and read him, because he's written huge tomes on this subject. He believes that that basically there are two pillars that need to be addressed in order to rebalance this discrepancy in income and in capital that exists in the world. Interestingly, the first of those pillars that he's chosen is to develop more employee ownership. Well, that's a surprise, isn't it? So he's discovered that now, and he believes that represents a great way of encouraging the redistribution of wealth throughout countries. So that's a good reason for supporting EO. Also, the distribution of capital is important, because that's a major barrier in the UK to education and things like healthcare. So it materially affects quality of life. And education is critical, because if people don't get the right kind of education, then they can't then go on and earn the material wealth which is necessary to them and also contribute to their communities. So we need to find better ways of doing this. And business is still in the UK, and I would guess that it's still the case in South Africa, but it's still often dominated by what I call short-term shareholder value. In other words, it's about owners who really think about their ownership of perhaps being owner of that business maybe for 10 years and then selling it on. And so what matters really to me is to maximize value, not to long-term develop it. And employee ownership offers a very stable and long-term model. It's worth reading Ha-Yun Chang, very interesting book called 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. It's a really good read. It's a short paperback. And this is one of the points that he makes in that book. Some key facts. Rhodri's already given you some. Population 3 million. Our geography is largely rural, with industry centred in the coastal areas around Capital and the valleys, Cardiff and the valleys. Like South Africa, we're a kind of mining history, really, in the country. Politically, we're part of the UK, but we have a devolved government. Well, that means that we have some control over raising local taxes, but some would argue not enough. It means that we have some say in the way in which we operate as a regional entity within the UK. But largely, most of the lawmaking is done at a UK level, and that obviously applies to employee ownership as well. Our economic indicators lag slightly behind the UK. And we also have our own language, Welsh language, which is important politically and culturally and practically in some areas. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. As Rhodri has said, we got involved in employee ownership as a result of the Margaret Thatcher's government at the time, going back into the late 80s, who wanted to close down all of the mining pits. And the purpose of putting this slide up is there's quite an important word on it. And the word is, I would suggest, that's important, is community. And it's still true that in our geography, some people will have a job in a valley where traditionally they've lived, and will find it very hard to consider going to another valley, which may only be 20 miles away, to get employment. So the whole idea of community is really important. So in closing these pits, as they did, they were actually killing the community. I mean, I come from a family of miners, so I have some emotional interest in this. One of the good things we were able to do was to help the miners at a particular colliery called Tower Colliery. So what are our key dates on our journey? Our first one is the Tower Colliery employee buyout in 1995, where we helped miners use their redundancy money with some other finance to buy a pit, which they said was finished. And it wasn't finished. It then was able to carry on for a good many years. Unfortunately, it has now closed, but there was economic life left in that pit, which had not been tapped. The centre, it was called the Welsh Cooperative Centre at the time this work was done. We started doing that work then back in 1995, really. That's when our employee ownership journey began. And then in 2008, we had obviously the economic crash, 2008, 2009, as you all know. Before that, there were lots of work was done by the centre in management buyouts and employee benefit trusts. Now, these employee benefit trusts were set up often to help with companies who want to introduce share schemes. So the employee benefit trust acted as a kind of warehouse of shares. So people could, when they left the company, they had to sell their shares back, and they sold them to the EBT. However, EBTs then fell into disrepute because certain people started exploiting them. So we had well-known footballers, for example, who decided that they would get a tax gain by being paid through an employee benefit trust. So this put the EBTs into rather shady territory, is the way I would describe it. In 2011, the Wales Cooperative Centre came back more strongly into employee ownership through a European funded programme. And in 2013, we supported the Employee Ownership Association and our good friend Graham Nuttall, who Tendani knows and mentioned earlier on the Nuttall Review of Employee Ownership, which looked at ways in which employee ownership could be developed and further promoted. This led in the UK in 2014 to a Finance Act, which led to the establishment of the Employee Ownership Trust, which is a very specific way in which employees can buy their companies. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And since then, we've had steady growth in employee-owned companies in Wales. And this has led in 2021 for the Welsh government, our government, local government, deciding that they would support this work more fully than they had in the past. They're now included in their policies. There's a policy to support it, and there's a policy to double the target of employee-owned companies. So this is beginning to look a little bit more encouraging now for us. We work within the UK, and obviously a lot of the work we do is connected with the Employee Ownership Association. So just a quick look at the UK situation. This is slightly out of date now. This was prepared in partway through 2021. But at that time, there were, according to the snapshot, there were 730 employee-owned businesses. But in 2020, there were 148 new ones. And at this time, when this snapshot was taken, there were 113 new businesses so far in 2021. Actually, I think it ended up more like 250 by the time we got to the end of 2021. So a lot more businesses. And in terms of the sectors, and Tendani mentioned some of the work that he's doing and his association is going to do in sectors. Across sectors, it was interesting that that now within the UK, the largest sector for employee ownership is now professional services, which includes things like architects, financial advisors. It includes things like consultancy companies, market research companies, and so on. So it's quite a wide category, really. And you'll note on the slide that that construction has gone up quite significantly from 11% to 17%, and has now gone even further. So the construction industry, following the emergence from COVID, is now going quite strong in relation to employee ownership. And these are some of the employee-owned companies that we have in Wales. So we've got architects such as like the Urbanists. Cwmni Da is a TV station and TV production company. It's the largest Welsh TV production company, as far as I'm aware. And the owners of that company were very concerned to keep Cwmni Da as a Welsh company. Its language, although it works in an international market, its operating language is in Welsh. And in that part of Wales, there are lots of Welsh speakers. So Welsh is really a cultural component of that company. And when we spoke to the owners first, they were very concerned to say, well, look, we want to keep this Welsh. We want to keep our language in the company. We want to do all those things. We want to keep the company independent, because as you probably know, in the media business, it's all about takeovers. People are taking over each other all over the place, often for dubious reasons. And in Cwmni Da, they said, well, we don't want that. We want to keep this company ours. We want to keep it in Wales. Tregoris Waffles baking company. They make biscuits. Wayfield, they're important market research. So I could go and spend a lot of time on this slide, but the point I want to get across to you is that it's very, very varied, the types of company that we work for. So the basic facts. So we use the EOA definition, and they define it as being at least 25% owned by the employees, and that most of the employees are involved. We now have 39 EO businesses in Wales, which, given the figures we've given a moment ago, probably seems quite small, and indeed it is. However, it's growing very fast. I'll explain why in a moment. The government target now is for it to double every 5 years, but it looks as if we're going to go much quicker than that. And hopefully that's encouraging to everybody involved in employee ownership. The interesting fact is that the development of the EOT, the Employee Ownership Trust, which emerged from the Graham Nuttall report of 2014, accounts for most of that growth. We're talking largely in our work about succession, employee owners becoming employee owners through owners leaving the company at some stage as part of a succession plan. As Rhodri hinted, there is usually an ethical aspect that is beyond profit in the owners we speak to. They often want to give the employees the opportunity of buying the company because they recognize that the employees have built the company, or largely built the company, and they want to give them the opportunity of taking it over. And it gives them a lot of immediate and ongoing personal flexibility because they can stay in the company or they can leave the company. And if they were get to the sell to a trade to another company, they would have very little flexibility in terms of how they would do it, because the buyer would probably insist that they, for example, worked longer, that they achieved certain targets, that part of the price will be dependent on future company performance, etc. So not a pleasant place to be if you're an owner who's built up a company over, say, 20 years. It has to be good for the business. So as I said earlier, we have to prove that the business will work following employee ownership. Owners like business as usual, and so do employees. So particularly if you use an employee ownership trust, it's a business as usual model. Nothing needs to change unless you want it to change. And if you want it to change, you can determine how it changes, not somebody else, like an investor or a buyer. In some parts of Wales, local values are important, such as the Cwmni Da TV story I told you a moment ago. And of course, it all needs to work for the employees too. The employees of the companies that we work with never cease to amaze me by some of the ideas they come up with. People are an enormous storehouse of ideas and energy. And as soon as they become employee owned, this energy is released. Tendani gave some information about the different kind of approaches to employee ownership, so I won't spend any more time on this. But I'd like to spend a bit of time on the EOT, because I think this was, for the UK, this has been the kind of trigger moment. I think the technical term is tipping point for employee ownership. The EOT was introduced partly, I think, because of the reputational problem that we have with EBTs. So we wanted to introduce a model that was certain, that was simplified, and that would enable itself, therefore, to be acceptable for certain tax advantages. We wanted also a model that was transparent and understandable for funders who were going to come along. We spend a lot of time, we have a national bank, Wales Development Bank, they call themselves, and we've had to spend quite a bit of time persuading them that that trusts are good things to invest in, and now fortunately they believe us and they've taken it on board, and we're seeing a lot of investment now in employee ownership trusts. It is, of course, an all-employee democratic model. So, you know, I don't know how that would sit alongside things like the BEE scorecard that you have here in South Africa. But it is all employees. So the quality model is very important in that. And there are tax incentives, but there are also very clear rules for trustees that have to be observed. So the EOT in UK and in Wales has become the mainstream solution. It's all employee solution and usually does not require any employee investment. Although, as Tendani correctly said, you can have alongside an EOT where the shares are held in trust, you can have some direct shareholdings, or indeed you can have share options alongside it. We have a scheme which was introduced in 2000 called Executive Management Incentives, which allows managers to have options, and these are given certain tax advantages. You can have those alongside the employee ownership trusts. So as long as the employee ownership trust, in order to qualify for tax advantages, has to exceed 51% of the equity and must always exceed 51% of the equity. But other than that, you know, there are other advantages that you can sit alongside, such as direct share ownerships alongside that shareholding. It's real ownership because the employees can participate in profits and they can vote on major company decisions. So this isn't some kind of woolly idea of employee ownership. There are real tangible benefits that you would get that are comparable to what you'd get as a shareholder in a company. And it can sit alongside, I say, direct share ownership and share options. So why would you use an EOT? Well, there's it makes all the major shareholder decisions. There's no outside interest unless you want to encourage additional investment. But it's not usually necessary. In most of the cases we've seen, it's not. It gives stability to the company and less volatile decision making than you would get in some cases. It ensures that the company always exists for the benefit of employees, both present and future. And that is a real important fact that we want to see enshrined in the way EOTs operate, that this is a long-term, stable arrangement for employees and for the company. And of course, the board, and usually there's there will always be in a trust situation, a trust board, usually a corporate trustee, a company set up to be a trustee with directors, including employee directors. That board can be a coherent buffer, a sounding board and communication channel within the company, between the company directors and the employees who are beneficiaries of the trust. So I've covered some of these advantages before, so I'm not going to waste any more time on this. Bear with me while we have some animations on here. This just shows schematically how an EOT is funded. And one important thing is that a company can use excess money, excess liquidity through its profits and reserves to fund an EOT, and it can gift that money to the EOT, and the EOT can then use that money to buy shares off the owner. And in many of the examples of EOT that we have in Wales, no bank loans have been used at all. No outside finance has been used at all. It's all been done with patient capital, using company profits, which can go on, these payments can go on for years and years. Through gifting that money to the EOT and using the EOT to buy those shares, it's a very stable arrangement. It means, of course, that there is a potential debt, or there is a debt to the owners, because these payments that they're waiting for are deferred and have not been paid out now, but will be paid out in the future. But at the end of the day, the employees are getting ownership of a company without having to make any investment at all, without any risk. So most of the employees we speak to are happy with that kind of arrangement. And the owners, of course, are getting some tax advantages. And in terms of how a company works, it works very similar to any other company. But basically, the operational side of the company carries on. That's the slide, the part in green, carries on as it normally does, with a board of directors and a management team, the employees. The EOT holds the shares in trust. It has a board of trustees. And in many companies, but not all, there is an employee council, which is actually written into the governance of the company. And that employee council usually has elected employees who can have got the rights to make certain demands on the company and do so. And they can also use the employee council as a real source of originality. It can be a source of ideas and source of additional value in terms of the debates that go on as to how the company is best managed and run. And the new indirect owners, employees, are on the right, as you see. They're looked after by the board of trustees who manage the trust. There are tax advantages to this. So if the requirements are met, and these requirements are set out in the Finance Act and linked to certain other parts of tax legislation which were in place formally in the UK, on the UK statute book. If these requirements are met, the transaction is exempt from capital gains tax. Normally within the UK, if you sell a business, any gain that you make on it is subject to what we call capital gains tax. If you sell more than 51% of your shares to an EOT, then you don't pay any capital gains tax at all. So that's quite attractive to owners, and often encourages owners to, even if they're staying on with the company, they'll often sell 100%, because they'll think, well, I'm doing this now. I've got one bite at the cherry. I get the tax advantage, so I'll sell all of the shares now, and we'll go fully employee-owned. That's quite common. If the EOT has a controlling interest, the company can pay bonus to employees, which will be tax-free to an annual limit of 3,600. And so you can design a bonus scheme if you're in an EOT company, and you can base it on the salary that people earned. You can base it on seniority, number of years that people have served and worked with the company. So people who work with the company a long time can have a better bonus. You can also recognise part-time earnings. So it's a fairly limited scheme in terms of bonuses. It's not a performance-related scheme, but it means that all of the employees share in it. and that's the key factor. So the specific tax legislation, which I've mentioned, it's my own view that this has conferred respectability and authority on employee ownership. And for many of the owners we speak to, the tax savings in themselves are not the most important aspect of the model. The fact that they're there gives it a certain credibility alongside all the other advice that they get when they sell their company. But it's the tax advantage, which would normally be in terms of absolute money, it'd be something like 10% of the sale value, typically, providing various conditions are met. So it's not a huge amount, really. If you're going to do this, you're not going to do it just for that reason. It comes back to what Rhodri was talking about. It comes back to the values, what these owners really want, what the comunidades want, like making sure that the company stays in Wales, for example. And there are certain, HMRC is our tax authority, Her Majesty's Revenue. They deal with all the tax situations in the UK, and the conditions that the trust has to meet. It has to be a trading company. It has to allow all employee participation requirements. So new joiners have to be beneficiaries. They can serve an introductory period before they become a beneficiary, but it can't exceed 12 months. There's an equality requirement, so all employees have to be treated equally. So, for example, trustees cannot lend money to individual employees because that would upset the equality requirement. There's a limited participation requirement. So a participator in UK law is one who owns 5% or more of the share capital of the company. So going forward, not more than 40% of the employees can be participators. And of course, the sale, because it's tax advantaged, the sale cannot take place above market value. So the valuation we place, I mentioned valuation at the beginning of the talk, is quite important. And governance is important as well, because that's the really at the heart of this. How does the company going to operate going forward once it's become employee owned? So every trust board is different, and the combination of company and trust have different forms of governance, although there are commonalities. Not all trusts in the UK use independent trustees, in other words, someone who's not connected with the company. Although I know Graham Nuttall is very keen that we make more use of independent trustees, because that was always going to be an important part of the model. And personally, I always ask for it. All of the trusts that I've been involved with in setting up have all had independent trustees, but across the UK, there are some that haven't. And as EOTs move forward, we have to ensure that the trustees remain vigilant and for example, meet all of the tax requirements, because otherwise any tax liabilities may fall on the trust. You know, they won't necessarily fall on the owners 4 years down the line. It could well fall on the trust. Openness is another thing. Sharing minutes, you know, should the trust board minutes be shared, for example, that doesn't always happen. Some of us think that it should, but it doesn't always happen. So there are variations in the way in which these things are managed. And sometimes the approaches to employee benefits are inconsistent. So you don't have to have the bonus scheme that I mentioned earlier on that has the tax advantage, and some companies don't have it. So conclusions. Employee ownership in Wales is growing faster, now part of government policy, but there's still a lot to be done. We're creating a sector where there's long-term stability through stable stakeholders rather than short-term shareholder value. So that's encouraging. And that links into the points I made earlier on about inequalities. The EOT has helped considerable, but as it becomes more popular, we must protect its values and purpose, and the purpose being genuine long-term ownership. In the review of these things that goes on, and budget representations which go on to HM Treasury, Magistrates Treasury, and to the Her Majesty's Revenue, who take the tax, we make points such as the fact that, that, for example, that we like to see all trustees being resident in the UK. In other words, we don't want any offshore element creeping into the into these trust arrangements. And we have to say also that inequality, as Piketty's figures show, is still a huge issue. And I'm not foolish enough to think that EO can solve all of those. However, I do believe it can make a contribution to helping with them. I'd just like to thank you again for being an attentive audience and coming to this presentation today. And thanks to our hosts for kindly inviting us. And obviously, if there are any questions, we'd be very happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Appreciate that. I sincerely appreciate the analogy, the correlation between the UK and South Africa and some of the concerns. You know, we often have this perception that because we are miles apart in every regard. And seldom do we realize that the similarities are, you know, can bring us together. There's so many lessons that we can learn from what you have done and your team has done, and from the research and the findings that you've presented today, that tells us that it's not an impossibility. We are also, I think, preparing to embrace, you know, employer ownership in South Africa. But on the bright side, the possibilities that you've presented us are encouraging. And it's not something that is, one could say, is a pipe dream, but clearly something that is attainable, that we can all work towards. And, you know, in this type of conversation and dialogue enables us to come together and examine possibilities and potential, and to just lean on, you know, individuals like yourself, Mr. Packman, and others internationally that are engaging with very important issue to bring some of those teachings back to South Africa. So I really thank you for that contribution. And I found the session to be highly informative. I'd like to hand you over to my colleague, Cindy, who's going to probably just raise some of the questions and answers that have been put up on the chat pane, and also to just complete the session, looking to the vote of thanks, and maybe also to bring in Tendani, who might want to say a few words before we close. But I'd love to hand you over to Cindy now. Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Mr. Packman. Really appreciated your time and energy in the session. Exciting stuff. We're looking forward to engaging with you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cindy.
Thank you, Janika. Can you guys hear me? Am I clear? Can you hear me?
100%. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, super. Thank you, Dr. Gorbent and the panelists. As I'm going through the questions at the moment, we actually don't have any questions at the moment. It's actually people who are acknowledging their presence. I mean, we have someone like Israel from the NPI who actually participated in the session, but there are no questions at the moment. I would like to encourage the participants to ask a few questions so that we can, if there are no questions, we will ask concluding remarks from the panelists. Or maybe let me allow Tendane to say something before we take the concluding remarks.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Rhodri, for a very valuable presentation that you presented to us. And then, as Dr. Gobind has already indicated, we really appreciate the sharing of information of Wales experience. And we really see for working with you going forward on other things to come. We are still planning other sessions or events in partnership with the Vet Business School around the issue of employee ownership. I think we are still planning to do one of the maybe annual conference that the association will want to convene, which I think will encourage it to do physical as well as virtually. Then we really think that what you contributed today, it will take us somewhere as a country, and then it will also help us to structure some of the debates or engagement that we want to engage on. With those few words, we really appreciate for you honoring our event today. Thank you.
That's pleasure.
Thank you, Prof. Cantrell. Any concluding remarks from your side? And if I can just chip in that from the participants, we have few people who are truly appreciating this opportunity, the fact that they have learned a lot. And a person by the name of Josi actually mentioned that this is a worthy, informative session, and she's looking forward to more of these sessions. Any concluding remarks from you, Prof. Cantrell?
Just really to say, thank you very much. I think that the EO will move forward, and it's important that we work together on this. So we've seen on the EOT front, for example, Australia now has its EOT legislation, and the first companies are now using the EOTs. We've got the prospects of VOTs in Canada. I know Graham Nuttall is very keen to promote this as a model across the globe. And I'm sure that, we are all keen to support. I know Tendani, you're talking to him as well. So I think we're all collectively trying to support EO and promote it across the world, and we must carry on doing that. And because I think this is one area where it's possible to make a real gain and a real dent in the issues of inequality. If we don't do it, then I think we will regret it in the longer term. So I think we have some windows of opportunity here as EO becomes more popular. We've got to make the most of that and see if we can turn it into the policies, as you mentioned earlier, Tendani, the national policies, for example, and then into the practice on the ground at the grassroots level to change this in a way that will lead to employees and workers having not only more rights, which I think, as you said earlier on, substantially in many countries now they do have that. In our countries they do, but it's more than rights. It's about having the ability to progress economically, through the work that they do. And that's something which, according to the figures, we're not collectively making as much progress there as most of us would like.
Thank you, Prof. Cantrell. To Rhodri, Mr. Packman, we have before we get to you, can we just take one question from Mark Rhodri. Mark would like to know if we have plans in South Africa to capacitate board of trustees around the issue of employee ownership?
Okay, I think that's a specific question that Paul can answer.
All right.
I think it refers to South Africa, doesn't it?
It refers to South Africa, and I thought Tendane or Dr. Gorbent will take that question and answer it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Siliso. Thanks, Mr. Lekgoli. I think there are plans going forward to provide training or capacitate the Board of Trustees because it's one of the problems that I think it's a serious major problem. As the association, I think when we are busy engaging with other key stakeholders, I think going forward, we might put together a fully packaged training that will be similar type of training like your IOD Institute of Institute of Directors,
Yeah.
whereby directors are trained. Then I think when I was still with Industrial Development Corporation, it's one of the issues that we once proposed, and I think Mr. Lekgoli knows very well because he used to work very closely with me on the issue of establishment of workers' trust. Then I think going forward, it's one of the programs that we're going to put on our plans as the association to say within the association, can we facilitate similar type of providing capacitation? Because you remember everything, when you start providing this type of services, you need to have sufficient resources in order to intervene, whereby you can provide different types of training that will be required by the Board of Trustees. Thank you.
Thank you, Tendane. There's another question that's from, okay, I forgot the name, but the question is, what measures can we put to firewall greed and corruption, especially in Africa? This question is open to everyone. Prof, if you are willing to answer that, what measures that we can put to firewall greed and corruption, especially in Africa, around this whole issue of EOTs? Anyone can answer that question?
Cindy, maybe I can go in, and I think this individual is asking for a magic bullet. And I think it's very hard to really come to something as conclusive as this in a session like this. It's, it requires a lot of, I think, progressive thinking, deliberate thinking, and also for individuals to acknowledge unethical practice and behavior. And maybe we need to challenge leadership in this regard because, it is something that can inflows in organizations from any position, whether it's upward or downward. But I think the context is quite unique. The nature, the historic practices is quite unique. And we cannot say that it is similar to other countries. But I think what we need to start doing is starting off with trust, transparency, and communication. If we follow through with this, where we establish trust that allows individuals to openly engage, transparency, so when individuals are engaging with large sums of money, that it is open and individuals are aware of the movement of those monies, and then communication. So we tend to seem to conceal a lot of information, and that just allows for further harboring of corruption and allowing for corruption to, infiltrate organizations without really looking to the needs and the interest of economic development or the individuals at hand. So I'm sure Tendane also has opinions, and maybe Prof, Paul, and Mr. Packman, from the outside, you have your own observations because these are our own experiences from the inside. But from the outside, your observations might be equally interesting. So maybe there's opportunity for discussion there. Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you. Can I add first, maybe? I think if you look at employee ownership as a vehicle, it has potential to can waterproof that part of corruption in one way or the other, on the basis that immediately when the employees are co-owners of the business, let's say the business is not 100% owned, and then the employees are just co-owners, then in one way or the other, if you educate them with regard to the issue of accountability, and they start understanding the issue of a sense of ownership to say that we own this company together, then they become security to their own assets or resources. Then obviously, then whatever corruption that will happen in that specific entity, then they will be able to root it out immediately, because they know now that when you start corrupting the company, then there is possibility that they may lose their jobs, they may lose the economic interest that they were going to get, then the company can just collapse in totality. But maybe to end corruption in totality, if we take it as a holistic approach in the country, I don't think employee ownership has that capacity. It can only uproot corruption within that specific entity where employees have interest, economic interest in that specific entity. Then that's what I can say, high level, to add what Dr. Gobind has just said. Thank you.
Yes, may I come in? Tendani, I think you're right. I think that, within employee ownership, for example, within the employee ownership trust situation, then obviously what is important really is having a really good trust board, the corporate trustee that's going to make decisions on behalf of all of the employees, needs to behave correctly. So that's a matter of initially of training and education, because most people who become directors of that trust board won't have done it before. So there's a possibility that they might make mistakes. So they need to understand what their legal situation is, being trustees of that EOT board. And then in terms of how it's structured, I think we believe the independent trustee is important in that regard, because the independent is not an employee of the company or a director of the company. The independent can have a genuine overview of the company, and if things are not happy, they can say something about that. And it's also important, for example, to in terms of owners who may wish, sometimes owners wish to be directors of the trust of the company, and there's nothing to prevent that. But it's our view that such directors, such owners who are who've sold shares should not be in a majority of that board. So in terms of the first thing to do is to ensure that proper governance is exercised, because if that isn't correct, then that opens the loopholes for all sorts of other behavior. But that doesn't mean to say that we can do everything about, if someone is, how shall we say, if someone is corrupt in their nature, then it's very hard to do something about that. But if your governance is good, the chances are that the majority can manage that situation. That's what one would like to think anyway.
Certainly. I'm not sure if Mr. Packman wants to add anything and also add your concluding remarks. Thank you.
I would just like to add, really, there's a clear and obvious line between something being legal and illegal. But when it comes to kind of moral and ethical considerations, there's often a kind of a grey area between those two. And Professor Paul mentioned it earlier about working with businesses that perhaps are interested in employee ownership and setting up an employee ownership trust because of the tax benefits. It's perfectly legal to do that. But as an organization ourselves, we prefer to be working with those organizations and those business owners who have that ethical and that moral purpose behind what they do. So there's always a grey area in some of these things when we're starting to address ethics and morality. And I think some of your points, Dr. Gobind and Tindani mentioned it earlier. I think a lot of that can be done through education and perhaps highlighting how that employee ownership and employee ownership trusts can actually positively impact on the employees themselves, giving them a voice, giving them a share, and how it impacts them as people, how it gives them more self-belief, how it gives them more empowerment, and how they can take that into the rest of their lives. And it's a really powerful thing.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to everyone. Especially our international guests, we truly appreciate the input. We learned a lot. As Dr. Gobind has said, we often think because you are far away, miles away, you are so different from us, only to find out it's only a matter of time. When we share experiences and lessons, we then realize that indeed there are a lot of similarities. And thank you to the Wits Business School for allowing us to host this webinar. To the participants, thank you for staying all 2 hours. I know it's not easy to be attentive for full 2 hours, but you were beautiful participants, or a group of people that participated. We will share this video online, not immediately, maybe tomorrow, and on our website, the Southern African Employee Ownership website, and on the Wits Business School website. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, colleagues. Enjoy your Jubilee functions that's coming about this week.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.